The desert air of Las Vegas shimmered with heat, even as twilight painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Inside the brand new International Hotel, though it was always a cool, controlled 72 degrees, a constant hum of air conditioning battling the desert's relentless embrace, and on this particular summer night in 1969, the hum was almost drowned out by a different kind of buzz anticipation. Betty clutched her tray, the clinking ice in the glasses rattling with her nerves. She'd been a cocktail waitress in Vegas for 3 years, long enough to know the rhythm of the town, the ebb and flow of the high rollers, and the hopeful tourists. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for this. Elvis Presley was coming not just for a show, but for a residency right here in her casino. "Another round for table 5, Betty?" a gruff voice called out from the bar. Betty nodded, forcing a smile onto her tired face. Her feet ached. They always ached. The long shifts, the endless walking between tables, the constant pressure to be quick, to be charming, to make enough tips to cover rent, and the ever-rising medical bills for her little sister. Clara's cough had gotten worse lately, and the doctors were starting to use words Betty didn't like. Words that tasted like fear in a shrinking bank account. Frank, the dealer at the blackjack table nearest Betty's section, caught her eye. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Frank was an institution. He'd dealt cards in Vegas since before Betty was born, seen countless stars come and go. He had a weathered face and eyes that had seen too many fortunes won and lost. He was cynical, but he had a quiet decency about him. He understood the grind. "Big night, huh, Betty?" Frank murmured, dealing out another hand. "Place is crawling with folks hoping to catch a glimpse of the king." "It's certainly lively," Betty replied, trying to sound upbeat. She watched a couple argue over a blackjack hand, their voices getting louder. This was the real Vegas, beneath the glamour, the desperation, the endless chase for a big win, and the quiet, often invisible struggles of the people who made the whole glittering machine run. Elvis Presley. The name hung in the air like a promise, or maybe a threat. The wild fans, the limousines, the larger-than-life presence. But what would he be like behind the scenes? Would he be demanding, arrogant, oblivious to the small people like her, who kept the drinks flowing and the cards dealt? Most celebrities were. They lived in a different world. A world where money was no object, where problems simply vanished with a phone call to an assistant. Betty topped off a martini, her movements practiced and smooth. She glanced towards the grand entrance of the showroom, where velvet ropes and eager security guards stood ready. Tonight was the first show. The excitement was palpable, a buzzing electricity that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She overheard snippets of conversations from the high rollers at her tables. Heard he rented out the entire top floor. Imagine the entourage. You think he'll gamble? He's the biggest star in the world, honey. Vegas will never be the same. Frank cleared his throat, drawing Betty's attention back, pointed discreetly with his chin towards a service entrance not far from the tables. A small commotion was brewing there, not the usual kind. There were no flashing lights or screaming fans, just a handful of quiet, respectful men in dark suits. And then him, Elvis Presley. He didn't stride in like a conquering hero. He slipped in almost casually, flanked by a couple of his Memphis Mafia guys. He wore a simple dark suit, not the flashy jumpsuits he was famous for on stage. His hair was impeccably styled, of course. In those eyes, they seemed to take everything in to really see. Betty froze. Trey held steady. She wasn't supposed to stare, but she couldn't help it. He was taller than she expected, and there was an aura about him, a quiet power that somehow filled the vast casino floor without him even trying. He paused for a moment, just observing. His gaze swept across the tables, over the bar, past the slot machines, and for a fleeting second, it landed on Betty. It wasn't a dismissive glance or an arrogant stare. It was curious, almost gentle, a flicker of something in his eyes, a shared understanding of the late hour, the working grind. Then he was gone, heading towards a private elevator. The doors closing silent behind him, realized she was holding. "Well," she whispered to Frank, "that was something." Frank merely grunted, shuffling his deck, but Betty noticed he hadn't looked away either. And there was a faint, almost imperceptible furrow in his brow, as if he too was wondering what kind of man this new king of Vegas would turn out to be. Casino floor returned to its usual roar, but a new, quiet expectation had settled over the staff. Their world had just shifted on its axis, and nobody knew exactly what the tremors would bring. Betty just hoped they would bring enough for Clara's medicine. The first few days of Elvis's residency were a blur of frenetic energy. The International Hotel was packed. Every show sold out, every slot machine shattered, every table buzzed. The staff, from the bellhops to the housekeepers, were stretched thin, working double shifts, fueled by coffee and the sheer adrenaline of it all. Yet amidst the chaos, a peculiar pattern began to emerge. It started small. Frank, usually unflappable, was the first to mention it to Betty during a rare, quiet moment at the service entrance, grabbing a quick smoke break. "You notice anything odd about Mr. Presley?" Frank exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes narrowed in thought. Betty shrugged, rubbing her aching temples. "He's a superstar, Frank. Everything about him is odd. The way he sings, the way people scream for him." "No, not that," Frank interrupted, flicking ash. "I mean, how he operates. Around us, she'd served him drinks a few times in the private lounge after shows. He always had a sweet tea, never anything alcoholic. He was polite, almost deferential, which was unusual for a celebrity. He'd thank her by name, even after just being introduced once. He'd listen patiently to his entourage, but also to the lowliest busboy. He's polite," Betty offered, remembering his gentle gaze from that first night. "More polite than some of the high rollers. Polite. Yeah, but more than that." Frank took another drag. "The other night, after his show, the casino floor was a mess. Spilled drinks, scattered chips, folks leaving their crumpled betting slips everywhere. Old Mr. Henderson, the night cleaner, he was looking utterly swamped, barely keeping up. He was nearly 70, his back permanently stooped from years of pushing heavy carts and scrubbing floors. He never complained, but everyone knew he struggled so," Betty prompted, intrigued. "Just a good job, Mr. Henderson." And then he was gone. Betty's jaw dropped. $200 for a cleaner. Most stars barely left a $5 tip for a bellhop, let alone a grand gesture like that. "Are you serious?" Dead serious. Henderson looked like he'd seen a ghost. Kept staring at the bills like they were funny money. Said Elvis just smiled, a real warm smile, and said, "Get yourself something nice, Mr. Henderson. You earn it." Frank flicked his cigarette butt into a metal bin. "And that ain't the only thing." Betty listened. Frank went on to describe how Elvis had bought entire trays of snacks from the kitchen staff late one night, then handed them out to the sleepy security guards on their breaks. How he'd complimented a bellhop on his efficiency and slipped him a $20 bill, even though the bellhop hadn't done anything directly for him. It was always quiet, always unexpected, and always seemed to be aimed at the people who were often overlooked. That night, Betty found herself paying closer attention. She saw Elvis on the casino floor again after another electrifying performance. He was signing autographs for a few lucky fans. His smile bright, his eyes still holding that curious, gentle spark. As he walked past her section, a young waitress, barely 18, stumbled, almost dropping a tray of champagne flutes. Her face flushed crimson, mortified. Elvis, without missing a beat, retrieved. One hand, his touch light and firm. "Whoa, there, sweetheart," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Easy does it, that's precious cargo." The waitress named Maria mumbled an apology. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Presley." Elvis just grinned. Then, his hand still on the tray, he subtly slipped the crisp $50 bill from his pocket and pressed it into her palm under the guise of steadying her. His fingers briefly brushed hers, and the warmth of the bill was undeniable. "For your trouble," he murmured, his eyes twinkling. He gave her a wink, and then continued on his way, leaving Maria staring at the money. Wide-eyed and speechless, Betty watched the whole exchange. It wasn't just the money. It was the way he did it, discreetly, kindly, making Maria feel seen, not just like a clumsy employee. He didn't draw attention to himself. He didn't make a show of it. He just helped. Later, as Betty was cashing out her tips for the night, she overheard a group of dealers talking. He gave Eddie a watch. Can you believe it? Just for helping him navigate the back corridors. My cousin, who works in the laundry, said he sent down a whole box of expensive chocolates for the staff there. Said they worked harder than anyone. It's like he's trying to empty his pockets on us. Someone joked, but there was a note of wonder in their voice. Betty thought about Clara, her little sister's frail cough, the mounting bills. $100, $200, even $50. It was a fortune to them. It wasn't enough to solve all her problems. Not yet, but it was a start. It was a glimmer of hope in a world that often felt harsh and unyielding. The other celebrities came, gambled, demanded, and left. Elvis was different. He didn't just walk the red carpet. He walked the service hallways. He didn't just shake hands with the high rollers. He shook hands and shared a knowing glance with the people behind the scenes. He's got a good heart, that man, Betty murmured to herself as she counted her meager tips. The rumors were no longer just rumors. They were becoming real. And for the first time in a long time, Betty felt a faint stir of something she hadn't felt much. In Vegas optimism, maybe, just maybe this king wasn't just here to conquer the stage, but to quietly bless the very foundations of this glittering city. The whispers about Elvis Presley's unusual generosity grew louder, spreading like wildfire through the labyrinthine corridors and staff break rooms of the International Hotel. What had started as isolated incidents recounted in hushed tones now blossomed into full-blown tales, shared and embellished, each one adding to the growing legend. "You hear about what he did for Tony the valet?" a bartender asked Betty one afternoon as she wiped down her section. "Tony's car broke down. Cost a fortune to fix. Elvis just heard him talking about it, casual-like. And later, Tony found a check for the full amount in his locker. No note, just a check." Betty had heard. She'd also heard about the time he bought an entire set of new poker chips for a dealer whose old ones were worn, or how he'd paid for a struggling young singer from the lounge to take vocal lessons. It wasn't just money, it was thought, care. He seemed to listen, truly listen to the everyday woes of the staff. And then, almost magically, problems would disappear. Frank, usually so reserved, had become an unlikely chronicler of these tales. He'd seen too many of them firsthand to deny it. "It's like he's got radar for folks who are down on their luck," Frank observed one evening, shuffling cards. "Most stars, they see us as part of the furniture. He sees us as people." Betty nodded, serving a fresh drink. Her own situation hadn't improved. Clara's cough had taken a turn, and the doctor was now talking about specialists, about hospitals, about a treatment that sounded expensive beyond Betty's wildest dreams. She spent her nights staring at the ceiling, calculating, budgeting, always coming up short. The glamour of Vegas felt particularly cruel when her own reality was so stark. She'd seen Elvis a few times more up close. He'd started coming down to the casino floor after his shows, walking among the crowd, sometimes stopping to chat briefly with a dealer or a bartender. He always had a kind word, a genuine smile, Betty noticed. He always remembered her name, and he'd ask how her shift was going. She often wondered if he remembered her from that first night, or if he just had a knack for remembering faces. One particularly grueling evening, Betty felt a cough catching in her own throat, a dry, anxious cough. She was exhausted, her feet throbbing, and the worry about Clara was a lead weight in her stomach. She hadn't eaten properly in days, trying to save every penny. As she walked past a high-stakes craps table, she felt a dizzy spell wash over her. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table, her tray clattering loudly. Immediately, a flurry of hands reached out to steady her. Casino security was there, in an instant, concerned faces surrounding her. "Miss, are you all right?" Betty mumbled an apology, trying to regain her composure. Just a little lightheaded long shift. Then a voice cut through the noise, calm and steady. "Give her some air, folks. She looks like she needs a break." It was Elvis. He had been nearby talking to a casino executive and had noticed her stumble. He moved with an easy grace, his presence radiating a quiet authority that instantly cleared a space around Betty. He knelt slightly, his famous blue eyes full of genuine concern meeting hers. "You look a little peaked, ma'am," he said softly, his voice a warm rumble. "Are you feeling okay?" Betty, mortified, but also touched by his direct concern, managed a weak smile. "Just tired, Mr. Presley. Thank you." He shook his head gently. "Tired is one thing, faint is another. You've been eating well, getting enough rest?" She mumbled, something non-committal about being fine. He paused, his gaze lingering on her. It wasn't intrusive, but it was incredibly perceptive. It felt like he was looking right into her, seeing past the uniform and the forced smile, seeing the worry lines, the exhaustion. "You work hard," he said, his voice lowering almost to a whisper. "Real hard, it shows. And you got a weight on your mind, don't you?" Betty's eyes welled up despite herself. How could he know? She just nodded, unable to speak. The sheer unexpected empathy from this global superstar was overwhelming. Elvis straightened up, then turned to one of the casino managers who had hurried over. "I think this young lady needs to take the rest of the night off," he stated, not as a request but as a quiet command. "Send her home and make sure she gets paid for the full shift." The manager, flustered, quickly agreed. "Of course, Mr. Presley, Betty, you heard him. Go on home." Betty could barely believe her ears. "A night off, fully paid." "Don't you worry about tips tonight," Elvis said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a thick wad of bills, peeled off several hundreds, and pressed them into her hand. "This ought to cover it. And then some. Go get some rest and maybe get whatever's bothering you sorted out. Life's too short to carry that kind of burden alone." He smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile, and then, with a nod to the manager, he moved on, once again leaving Betty speechless. The crisp $100 bills felt impossibly warm in her palm. It wasn't just a night's wages. It was more than she made in a week. It was a lifeline. Betty walked numbly to the locker room, her head swimming, not from dizziness but from shock and a nascent, unfamiliar hope. She sat down, clutching the money. This was different. He hadn't just given money, he had seen her. He had understood, on some deeper level, that her problem wasn't just about being tired. That night, for the first time in weeks, Betty slept soundly. The next morning she used a portion of the money to call the specialist Clara needed. It was an initial consultation, but it was a start. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, had somehow, in his quiet way, extended a helping hand, not just to a tired waitress, but to a desperate sister. The rumors were true. And for Betty, they had just become deeply, personally real. The hope that had flickered inside her was now a small, steady flame. Betty returned to work 2 days later, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in months. The specialist had seen Clara. It was serious but not hopeless. The initial consultations and tests were expensive, but thanks to Elvis's unexpected gift, she could afford them. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time she felt like she wasn't drowning. The moment she stepped onto the casino floor, Frank spotted her. His usual gruff expression softened slightly. "Look who decided to rejoin the living, feeling better." "Much better, Frank." "Thanks to well, you know." Betty gave him a knowing look. "He really is something, isn't he?" Frank nodded slowly. "He is. And it's not just the money he talks to people, Betty. He listens. That's rarer than a royal flush in this place." Betty found herself observing Elvis more closely in the days that followed. It was true, he didn't just throw money around, he interacted. He asked the kitchen staff about their families. He remembered a security guard's recent promotion. He even shared a laugh with one of the janitors about a spill that had required heroic efforts to clean. He treated everyone with genuine respect, as if their jobs, no matter how small, were as important as his own. One afternoon, Betty was working in the quieter lounge area, polishing glasses. She was deep in thought about Clara's upcoming tests, the worry creeping back despite the initial relief. She didn't even notice Elvis approach until his voice, soft and warm, spoke beside her. "How's that little sister of yours, Betty?" Betty nearly dropped a glass. She spun around, her heart leaping. "Mr. Presley, she's thank you for asking." She fumbled for words. "The specialist thinks they can help her. It's going to be a long road. But we have hope now." Elvis nodded, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't in his flashy stage attire, just a casual shirt and slacks, looking approachable. "Hope is a good thing to have, Betty. It's the most important thing, really." He paused, leaning against the bar counter. "What exactly did the doctor say? Is it her lungs?" Betty, surprised by his detailed interest, found herself opening up. She explained Clara's condition, the various tests, the doctor's cautious prognosis. She spoke about her fears, the sleepless nights, the feeling of being overwhelmed. She didn't know why she was telling him all this. He was a superstar, she was a waitress, but his eyes held such genuine empathy, such a deep, quiet understanding, that the words just tumbled out. He listened, never interrupting, never judging. He just absorbed every word, his brow furrowed in concern. "You know," he finally said, his voice gentle, "when I was a boy, my mama, she got real sick sometimes. Folks didn't have much then, and doctors were a luxury. We had to rely on folks helping folks. Hand up, not a handout, you know." He gazed out at the lounge. "I learned early on that sometimes. The biggest help ain't just money. It's knowing someone cares, knowing you ain't alone." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook and a pen. "Tell me the specialist's name again." Betty hesitated. "Dr. Matthews. Why?" He wrote it down. "Just in case I know some good people. Doctors, specialists, folks who understand the system. Sometimes a phone call from the right person can cut through a lot of red tape. Speed things up." He tore out the page and handed it to her. "You ever feel like you're hitting a wall, or if you just need someone to talk to about it, you call my assistant Joe. He'll get a message to me. Don't you ever feel like you're bothering me, understand?" On it, in Elvis's own handwriting, was the name of his assistant and a number. It wasn't just a tip or a donation. It was an offer of support, a connection, a promise that he was there, not just as a benevolent stranger, but as someone who genuinely cared about her and Clara's well-being. It was more than money. It was a personal lifeline. "Mr. Presley," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know what to say. You've already done so much." He just smiled, a soft, almost melancholic smile. "Just promise me you'll take care of yourself. And that little sister of yours, that's all the thanks I need." He gave her a brief, reassuring pat on the shoulder, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the casino crowd. Betty stood there for a long moment, clutching the note she thought about his words. In that moment, surrounded by the dazzling, indifferent spectacle of Las Vegas, Elvis Presley had made her feel less alone than she had felt in years. He wasn't just the king on stage. He was a king of hearts, quietly building a kingdom of kindness, one small, profound act at a time. The world of celebrities was supposed to be cold and distant, but Elvis had shattered that illusion. He was proving that even in a city built on illusion, true generosity could shine brighter than any neon sign. Weeks turned into a month. Clara's condition fluctuated. Good days followed by bad. Betty was exhausted, juggling work, hospital visits, and a growing stack of medical bills. The money Elvis had given her had bought time and initial diagnoses, but the path ahead was still daunting. She hadn't used the note he'd given her, hesitant to bother him to presume on his kindness further. She was just a waitress after all. Then came the call from Dr. Matthews. Clara needed a specialized procedure. Urgently. It was incredibly expensive, cutting edge, and only a few hospitals in the country offered it. Insurance would cover a fraction. The rest was a mountain Betty couldn't possibly climb. Despair, cold and heavy, settled over her. She sat on her tiny apartment floor. The medical forms fanned out around her, tears blurring the numbers on the page. This was it. She was at the wall Elvis had spoken of. With trembling hands, she found the crumpled piece of paper Elvis had given her. Joe, his assistant. What was the worst that could happen? He could say no. He could dismiss her. But the thought of Clara struggling to breathe propelled her forward. She called the number. A friendly but efficient voice answered. "Joe Esposito, how can I help you?" Betty swallowed hard. "Mr. Esposito, my name is Betty. I'm a waitress at the International Hotel. Mr. Presley, he gave me this number. My little sister, Clara. She needs a procedure, and I don't know what to do." She poured out the story, the desperation clear in her voice. Joe listened patiently. He didn't interrupt, just made a few quiet notes. "Betty, I understand. Let me make a few calls. Can you give me the doctor's name again? And the hospital?" Betty gave him the details, her voice wavering. "Thank you, Mr. Esposito. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," Joe replied, but his voice was kind. "Mr. Presley always says you gotta help people when they need it most. I'll be in touch." The call ended. Betty hung up, her heart pounding. Had she done the right thing? Would anything come of it? She tried to focus on her shift, but her mind kept replaying the conversation. 2 days later, Betty was surprised by a knock on her apartment door. It wasn't the landlord or a bill collector. It was Joe Esposito himself standing there with a briefcase behind him. "Betty," Joe said, a warm smile on his face, "mind if I come in for a minute?" Betty, stunned, stepped aside. Joe entered, looking around her small, tidy apartment with polite deference. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "Mr. Presley heard about Clara," Joe began, his voice serious. "He remembers your conversation. He wants to help." Betty braced herself for a smaller sum, a generous donation perhaps, but nothing that would truly cover the enormity of the cost. "He's made arrangements," Joe continued, his eyes meeting hers. "Clara's procedure is recommended of next wast. The procedure, the hospital stay, the medication even, follow-up care for the next 6 months are being taken care of, fully paid." Betty stared at him, speechless. The words didn't quite register. "All of it, but how?" "Mr. Presley has a lot of resources, and he believes in helping folks who help themselves. He knows you work hard. He knows you love your sister. He wants her to get better, Betty. He wants you to have peace of my table. Here's all the paperwork. You just need to sign a few consent forms. Everything else is handled." Tears streamed down Betty's face, silent and hot. It was too much. The relief was so profound it stole her breath. She picked up the forms, her fingers tracing the words. It was real. This wasn't a dream. He didn't have to do this," she whispered, her voice choked. "He knows he doesn't have to," Joe said gently, "but he wants to. He understands what it's like to worry about family, to struggle. He wants you to focus on Clara getting well, not on the bills." That day marked a turning point. Clara had her procedure, and it was a success. The recovery was long and challenging, but the weight of financial burden had been lifted. Betty could now spend her evenings by Clara's bedside, reading to her, talking to her, without the crushing anxiety of debt looming over them. Elvis never spoke to Betty directly about the money or the arrangements. He would just offer a quiet nod when he saw her, a gentle smile, and sometimes ask, "How's your sister doing, Betty?" And when Betty would reply, She's doing so much better, Mr. Presley, thank you. He would just smile, that warm, knowing smile, as if to say, I knew she would, and I knew you'd make it happen. He wasn't just a king on a stage anymore. He was a guardian angel, a quiet force of compassion in a city of glitz and illusion. He had not just given Betty money. He had given her her sister's health, her peace of mind, and a profound, life-altering belief in the power of human kindness. Casino staff, who heard whispers of the extent of his generosity, looked at him differently now. He was more than a superstar. He was one of them. A man who understood the struggles of everyday life and chose to use his power to make it a little easier for others. News, even hushed and unofficial, travels fast in the tight-knit world of casino staff. What Elvis did for Betty and Clara wasn't something that could be kept entirely under wraps. Joe Esposito was discreet, and Betty herself was naturally private. But the sheer impact of Clara's sudden, successful medical treatment, coupled with Betty's newfound relief, couldn't be hidden. Whispers turned into open discussions in break rooms behind poker tables and on long elevator rides. You hear about Betty's sister? Yeah, the one with the cough. She's doing great now. I heard Mr. Presley well, you know. No way, all of it. That's what they say, every penny. What a guy. Frank, the seasoned dealer, had been one of the first to put the pieces together. He'd seen Betty's quiet desperation, then her transformation, cornered her during a lunch break, a rare, serious look on his face. Betty, I don't mean to pry, but is it true about Clara and Elvis? Betty looked at him, her eyes still holding a hint of unshed tears from the sheer gratitude. It is, Frank, she confessed softly. He paid for everything. He saved her life. He said he understood what it was like to worry about family. He didn't want me to carry the burden alone. Frank slowly shook his head, a genuine look of awe spreading across his usually cynical features. Well, I'll be damned. I've seen movie stars throw temper tantrums over the wrong brand of champagne. I've seen politicians cheat at blackjack and walk away without a backward glance. Never. His voice was low, filled with a newfound reverence. He truly is the king, isn't he? From that day on, Frank became one of Elvis's staunchest, if quiet, defenders. If a skeptical new hire questioned the stories, Frank would clear his throat. Let me tell you something about Mr. Presley, he'd begin, and then recount a tale sometimes about Mr. Henderson, sometimes about Maria, but always eventually about Betty and Clara. He doesn't do it for the headlines, he does it because he cares. You won't find another one like him in this town. The atmosphere among the staff began to shift subtly. The grind was still the grind. The hours still long, but there was a new sense of pride, a quiet camaraderie. They worked for a place that hosted Elvis Presley, and more than that, they worked in the same building as a man who genuinely valued them. It wasn't just about the potential for a generous tip. It was about the feeling of being seen, acknowledged, respected. One night, after a particularly late show, Elvis was walking through a deserted section of the casino, heading to his private elevator. A group of housekeepers were finishing up their shift, tired, but diligently pushing their carts. As he passed them, one of the older women, Maria, a different Maria, the lead housekeeper, paused her work. "Mr. Presley," she called out, her voice a little shy. Elvis stopped. "Everything all right?" Maria, emboldened by his kindness, stepped forward. "Wait, we just wanted to thank you, sir, for everything, for what you do for everyone. Here, we hear the stories. It means the world to us." She gestured to her colleagues, who nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears. Elvis's smile softened further. He looked genuinely touched, almost a little embarrassed. "Folks, you don't need to thank me. You work harder than anyone. You keep this whole place running. I just try to do what feels right." He paused, looking at their tired but grateful faces. "You all are the heart of this place. Don't you ever forget that." Then, to their astonishment, he did something utterly unexpected. He reached out and shook each of their hands, looking them in the eye, offering a genuine word of thanks or encouragement. "You keep up the good work, Maria, and bless you for what you do." For the housekeepers, often invisible, this small act of personal recognition from the biggest star in the world was more precious than any monetary gift. The gratitude wasn't just verbal. The staff started doing small things. In return, Elvis's favorite sweet tea would always be ready for him. His dressing room was always spotless, stocked exactly to his liking with a fresh flower in a vase. His favorite dealer, Frank, always made sure his table was perfectly set, the cards crisp. There was a silent mutual respect that had blossomed. Betty, now watching Clara thrive, continued her work with renewed vigor. She saw Elvis often, and each time he'd offer that kind nod, that knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged through generosity. She sometimes saw him talking to other staff members, a quiet conversation, a hand disappearing into a pocket, a look of stunned gratitude on the recipient's face. He wasn't just giving money. He was giving dignity, hope, and a sense of belonging in a city that often made people feel transient and disposable. He was the unacknowledged, compassionate backbone of the International Hotel, a true king to his devoted, grateful subjects. Not everyone understood Elvis Presley's quiet crusade of kindness. In a city where every gesture was often scrutinized for its publicity potential, his genuine, unassuming generosity sums raised eyebrows, particularly among those who viewed the casino purely as a bottom line. Mr. Peterson, a stern, numbers-driven executive who oversaw the hotel's budget, was one such individual. He'd heard the whispers, seen the occasional expense reports that seemed to defy explanation, large sums of cash going out without a clear marketing or promotional label. He was a man who believed in efficiency and profit, not in what he considered charity to the hired help. One afternoon, Peterson spotted Elvis in a seemingly casual conversation with a young busboy named Marco. Marco was telling Elvis about his aspirations to go to culinary school, but how he was saving every penny for his family. Back home, Elvis listened intently, nodding, then pulled out his wallet. Peterson watched his face tightening as Elvis discreetly pressed a thick envelope into Marco's hand. Peterson strode over a forced smile on his face that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Mr. Presley," he began, his voice overly cordial. "A moment of your time, if you please." He gave Marco a dismissive glance. Marco flustered, quickly disappeared. "Mr. Peterson," Elvis greeted, his voice calm but with an underlying firmness that Peterson found surprisingly difficult to challenge. "Just wanted to touch base," Sir Peterson said, trying to sound jovial. "Everything to your satisfaction. We aim to please our esteemed guests, especially our headliners." "Everything is more than satisfactory, Mr. Peterson," Elvis replied, his gaze steady. "Your staff here, they work incredibly hard. They're a credit to the International." Peterson cleared his throat. "Indeed, dedicated workers. We pride ourselves on our professionalism," lowering his voice. "I've been hearing some unusual reports about your personal interactions with the staff and certain financial disbursements." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "We appreciate your, shall we say, magnanimity, but it can create expectations, and it's not exactly standard operating procedure for a celebrity to be, well, tipping." The entire worm hardened almost imperceptibly. His smile, though still present, became a little less friendly. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "I do believe what I do with my own money is my own business. I earn it and I decide where it goes." "Of course," Peterson backtracked, sensing the shift in Elvis's demeanor. "It's simply a matter of precedent. We don't want to set a precedent where staff expect unsolicited payments. It can disrupt the hierarchy, the professionalism." "Disrupt the hierarchy," Elvis repeated, a hint of steel in his voice. "Mr. Peterson, these are good, honest people trying to make a living. They work long hours, often for little pay away from their families. They clean up after the high rollers, they serve the drinks, they make sure this grand hotel runs smoothly. Without them, there'd be no shows, no gamblers, no profits for you to count. He stepped closer to Peterson, his height and presence suddenly more imposing. I come from humble beginnings. Sir, I know what it's like to struggle to worry, what it's like to struggle too long. To dream of a better life but not see a clear path to it if I had been blessed with more than I need. And I consider it my duty, not a disbursement, not a tip, not a disbursement, not a tip, a helping hand. Peterson stammered, clearly taken aback by Elvis's quiet intensity. Perception, Mr. Presley. People might think you're trying to buy loyalty, or perhaps even control. Elvis let out a short, humorless laugh. Loyalty, Mr. Peterson, is earned, not bought, and control. I just want to see good people have a fighting chance. That's all. I don't want anything from them, except maybe for them to hold their heads high and know that someone believes in them. And if that disrupts the hierarchy of your spreadsheets, then perhaps your spreadsheets are missing something important. A human element, perhaps. He gave Peterson a final piercing look that seemed to challenge the executive to argue further, then turned and walked away, his stride purposeful. Peterson stood there for a moment, flustered, watching Elvis disappear. He knew he hadn't won that argument. He also knew deep down that there was a truth to Elvis's words, a moral authority that transcended profit margins. Later that evening, Frank found Betty, a small grin on his face. You hear about Peterson and the king? Betty shook her head, intrigued. Frank recounted the exchange, his eyes sparkling with satisfaction. Peterson tried to tell him off for being too generous. Can you believe the nerve? What did Elvis say? Betty asked, leaning closer. Oh, he put him in his place all right, Frank chuckled. Told him we're the heart of the hotel. Told him it wasn't about money, but about helping good people. Made Peterson look like a cheap suit. Frank shook his head, a genuine smile on his face. That man, he said reverently, he's got backbone and a heart bigger than this whole casino. The incident, though hushed, reinforced the staff's admiration for Elvis. He wasn't just generous with his money. He was generous with his principles. He stood up for them, not just with gifts, but with his words, defending their worth against the cold calculations of management. He was truly their king in every sense of the word. Elvis sat alone in his lavish suite, the Vegas skyline a glittering tapestry outside his window. The roar of the casino floor, usually a distant hum, felt miles away tonight. He had just finished a grueling series of shows, his voice raw, his body tired. But his mind was wide awake, replaying the conversation with Mr. Peterson earlier that day. A human element, perhaps. He wasn't trying to be preachy or confrontational, but Peterson's attitude had struck a raw nerve. The way he talked about the staff as if they were just numbers, nameless cogs in a giant machine. It reminded Elvis too much of a time he remembered all too well, a time when he and his family had been just that, nameless, struggling. Overlooked, his thoughts drifted back to Tupelo, Mississippi, the small two-room house, humble even for its time. His daddy Vernon, working hard but never quite getting ahead. His mama Gladys, the rock of their lives, always doing her best with what little they had. He remembered the worn-out shoes, the patched-up clothes, the meals that stretched a single chicken for days. He remembered the quiet dignity with which his parents faced their struggles, and the quiet despair that sometimes crept into their eyes. He remembered the feeling of wanting something so desperately, a new guitar, a better life for his mama, but knowing it was impossibly out of reach. He remembered the kindness of neighbors who shared a loaf of bread or a helping hand when Vernon was out of work. Those small acts of generosity, offered when they had nothing to give in return, had left a deeper mark on his soul than any record deal or sold-out concert ever could. Mama always said, "Elvis, remember where you came from." he murmured to the quiet room, his voice raspy. "She always told me never to forget the folks who are doing the real work, the ones who ain't got the spotlight on them." When fame hit, it had been a whirlwind. Money, success, everything he'd ever dreamed of. But he'd made a promise to himself and to Mom. He wouldn't let the flashing lights blind him to the struggles of others. He wouldn't become like those cold, distant celebrities who treated the working man like dirt. He wouldn't forget. He thought of Mr. Henderson, his stooped back diligently cleaning up the mess of the wealthy. He thought of Maria, the young waitress, blushing with embarrassment after her stumble. He thought of Marco, the busboy, with dreams of culinary school, his eyes alight with ambition despite his circumstances. And most of all, he thought of Betty and her brave little sister Clara. The fear in Betty's eyes, the quiet desperation that reminded him so much of his own mother's unspoken anxieties. He knew what it felt like to be on the other side, to watch a parent get sick and feel utterly helpless, to wish for a miracle that never came. He'd lost his twin brother Jesse. At birth, he'd lost his beloved Mama. The pain of helplessness, of loss, still resonated deep within him. And if he had the power, the means to ease that pain for someone else, even just a little, then how could he not? He often made his gifts discreetly, almost secretly, to avoid any fanfare. It wasn't about buying loyalty. He simply wanted to see people thrive. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about something far deeper, something that resonated with the very core of his being. It was about gratitude. Gratitude for his own improbable journey from poverty to superstardom. Gratitude for the blessings he'd received, and a profound sense of responsibility that came with that gratitude. He often wondered if anyone truly understood. Most people saw the jumpsuits, the sneer, the millions. They saw the king of rock and roll. But very few saw the boy from Tupelo, the one who still remembered what it was like to be hungry, to be afraid, to feel invisible. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the glittering city. Vegas, a place built on dreams and illusion, where fortunes were made and lost in a blink. But beneath the neon, there were real people with real lives, real struggles, and real dreams. And as long as he had a voice, as long as he had a penny in his pocket, he would use it to help those people. It was an act of remembrance, a tribute to his past, a quiet reaffirmation of the values his mama had instilled in him. It was simply the king's heart beating for those who often went unheard. He thought of Betty, her face transformed by relief when Clara was safe. That was his payment. That quiet knowledge that he had made a difference in a real tangible way, it was far more valuable than any sold-out show or gold record. It was living out the lessons of his humble beginnings. In the dazzling, improbable setting of Las Vegas, years passed. The International Hotel, later renamed the Las Vegas Hilton, continued to host Elvis Presley, whose residency became legendary. His jumpsuits grew more elaborate, his concerts more electrifying, but his heart, the one that beat for the everyday people, remained unchanged. The whispers of his generosity never ceased. In fact, they only deepened, solidifying into an unspoken understanding among the staff. Betty, now a seasoned shift supervisor, often found herself sharing his story with younger waitresses, fresh-faced and wide-eyed, just as she once was. Clara, now a vibrant teenager, healthy and thriving, was a living testament to Elvis's kindness. Betty had bought a small silver locket for Clara, and inside she'd placed the worn, folded piece of paper with Joe Esposito's number, a constant reminder of the miracle that had saved her. He never forgot a face, never forgot a name, Betty would tell them, pouring coffee in the break room. He'd ask about your kids, your parents. He'd notice if you were having a bad day. He just saw you. Frank, who had long since retired from the blackjack tables, became the unofficial historian of Elvis's good deed. He'd sit in the casino lounge, a cup of coffee in hand, observing the new generation of staff. If he heard a grumble or a cynical remark about celebrities, he'd clear his throat. "Let me tell you about the king," he'd begin, and his voice would lower, filled with the wisdom of years and the warmth of memory. He'd tell stories of the surprise Christmas bonuses Elvis gave to every single employee, from the cleaning staff to the cooks, sometimes totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. He'd recall how Elvis paid off a mortgage for a kitchen worker whose wife was battling cancer, or how he purchased brand new cars for dozens of his closest associates and staff members. It wasn't just the big gifts, Frank would emphasize. It was the little things, the quiet compliments, the genuine concern. He didn't want thanks. He just wanted to help. The casino itself transformed over the years, but the spirit Elvis had fostered lingered. There was a palpable difference in the morale of the staff who had worked during his era. They carried themselves with a quiet pride, a sense of having been part of something truly special, something that went beyond mere employment. They had served a man who served them in his own unique way. Elvis continued his acts of kindness right up until his final Vegas show. The famous Cadillac dealership in town knew him well. He'd buy cars for friends, family, and more often than not, for hotel employees he felt deserved a boost: a security guard's retirement fund, a housekeeper's dream vacation, a bellhop's child's college tuition. The stories were endless, whispered from one generation of staff to the next, becoming part of the very fabric of the hotel's history. His dressing room, which became almost a shrine after his passing, was filled with small, handmade gifts from the staff: a crocheted doily, a framed photograph of the hotel, a personalized mug. These weren't grand gestures, but tokens of genuine affection and respect. They were tangible proof that his generosity had fostered not just gratitude, but real connection and warmth. For Betty, the legacy of Elvis was deeply personal. Clara, now in college, was studying to become a nurse, inspired by the medical professionals who had saved her life, and by the extraordinary act of kindness that had made it all possible. Every time Betty saw a young staff member struggling, she'd remember her own past, and she'd remember Elvis. She started her own small fund, discreetly helping colleagues, in crisis perpetuating the chain of kindness he had started. The legend of Elvis Presley in Las Vegas wasn't just about the music or the sold-out shows. It was about the man behind the myth, the one who saw the invisible hands that made the city sparkle and chose to bless them. He didn't just leave behind a legacy of music, he left behind a legacy of unparalleled generosity, etched into the hearts of the thousands of casino workers whose lives he had touched. He wasn't just a king to his fans, he was a king to the unsung heroes of the Vegas Strip, and his kindness resonated long after his final curtain call. Decades had passed since Elvis Presley first stepped onto the stage of the International Hotel. The building itself had changed names, undergone renovations, but the stories, the legends of the king still echoed through its halls, especially among the long-serving staff, or those who had heard the tales passed down from their parents and grandparents. Betty, her hair now flecked with silver, sat in the bustling employee cafeteria, sipping coffee. Her work uniform was a comfortable, familiar weight on her shoulders. She was still here, still part of the heart of this grand hotel, overseeing new generations of eager, often struggling young men and women. Frank, though long retired, still visited occasionally, hobbling a little now, but his eyes still sharp, his mind still filled with memories. He shuffled over to Betty's table, a familiar grin on his face. Heard a new kid in the valet parking, asking about the old days. Frank chuckled, settling into the chair opposite her. Couldn't believe it when I told him Elvis used to buy brand new Cadillacs for folks. He thought I was pulling his leg. Betty smiled, a soft, fond look in her eyes. They just don't make 'em like that anymore, do they, Frank? Nope, he agreed, shaking his head. Most of them, they come in, they make their money. They leave, never look you in the eye, never ask your name. But Elvis did, Betty mused, looking out the window at the dazzling Vegas skyline. He saw us, all of us. He saw our struggles, our dreams. He remembered what it was like to be an ordinary person trying to get by. She thought of Clara, now a brilliant nurse helping others, just as she had been helped. The ripple effect of one man's kindness. It wasn't just the money. It was the feeling the feeling that someone, the most famous man in the world, cared, that he understood, that he valued their silent, often thankless work. It changed the very atmosphere of the hotel for those who experienced it. It instilled a sense of loyalty, not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection and respect for a man who had shown them so much. "Remember old Mr. Henderson?" Frank suddenly asked, his voice softer. "He used those $200 Elvis gave him to buy a new pair of boots. Said he hadn't had proper, comfortable boots in 30 years. Walked like he was floating after that. And Maria, the young waitress," Betty added, "she used that $50 bill for her first proper voice lesson. She's singing in a lounge downtown now, you know. Still tells the story of Elvis steadying her tray." The stories were endless, woven into the very fabric of the hotel, passed down like precious heirlooms. They became more than anecdotes. They became a testament to a unique human spirit. In a city of fleeting fortunes and manufactured glamour, Elvis Presley had created something real, something lasting. He had built a legacy of love, compassion, and generosity that touched thousands of lives. It wasn't just a legend from a bygone era. It was a living truth in the hearts of the people who had been there. They remembered his smile, his quiet nod, the warmth in his eyes. They remembered the hand that reached out, not to take, but to give. When Betty eventually retired, she left behind a small embroidered handkerchief for the younger staff, carefully placed in the break room. On it, she had stitched a simple phrase: "Remember the king, be kind." It was her way of passing on the most valuable lesson she had learned in her long career in Las Vegas. Elvis Presley's music would forever be etched in history, his performances iconic. But for the casino dealers, the cocktail waitresses, the housekeepers, the busboys, and the security guards of the International Hotel, his greatest performance was off-stage. It was in the quiet corners, in the discreet gestures, in the genuine understanding he offered to the unsung heroes of Las Vegas. His generosity was indeed the stuff of legend, a heartwarming tale of a king who never forgot his roots and who used his crown not to rule, but to uplift, proving that the most powerful form of magic isn't found in a deck of cards or a rolly, generous heart. And that, more than anything, was why the legend of Elvis Presley, the generous king, would live on forever in the heart of Vegas.